You don't get to know Jasper's work by knowing him. You actually don't really know him ever, I don't think. I think he's elusive to himself. And I think a lot of his work is a game of hide and seek. It's a matter of drawing people into his world. I don't know what kinds of relationships he has with people other than my relationship with him, but I think the stories that I've heard are pretty much consistent with my own. He likes people. He's not a cold person, but he is also not willing to make himself known really very easily. I think his influences were mostly not to be misread, not to be slotted into the sort of Pollock de Kooning tradition, was to tack off the wind of art at that time and to take a course that was not prescribed or foreseen or sanctioned. And so he made paintings that were difficult, hard to respond to, and he did so with a purpose, and it was so they would be noticed, and they were. And so the initial response to abstract expressionism had been negative, but then people got on board and then they couldn't think of anything else but. And then Jasper was the next increment where he said, okay, fine, I'm now going to get off this train and I'm going to do something differently and I'm going to do it this way. What made its impression on people was what he did not do. And it's the place where his reticence locked into a certain kind of, I think, exhaustion in the art world with strong feelings, strong brushwork, and so on of that kind. What people thought of as being expressionism, what people thought of as being the bearing of the soul of the artist in the painting, and so on. So I think his refusal to do that, his inability to do it perhaps, but mostly his refusal, meant that he was really difficult for the art public of that time to deal with, but also interesting because those difficulties turned into something else. The prime critic of that period is Leo Steinberg, and Leo Steinberg wrote very well about Jasper from very early on. And what he did was he sort of enumerated the ways in which Jasper defied expectations and then proceeded to flesh out a world of his own. And when I say flesh out, that's part of the issue. Abstract Expressionism was, in the case of de Kooning in particular, a case of the flesh being made visible and the flesh of the painting being flayed, basically. And then in later times, it was other people who were doing other things where the body was active as the protagonist of the painting, as the body that reaches across a wide surface, that gesticulates energetically and muscularly and so on. Jasper did none of that. He really did not want to be read so easily and did not, I think, identify with those kinds of paintings in that way. So when you looked at his paintings, you slowed down. When you looked at his paintings, you did not see flesh, in erotically charged flesh. You didn't see, you didn't see the skinning of the canvas. You didn't see any of that kind of stuff. What you saw was a very deliberate, slow, chilly kind of image. And I said in one of the things I wrote about him is almost clammy flesh. It's almost like what happens when flesh cools. And you saw that in his paintings, not just the ones that are, explicitly flesh-like, but the ones where the paint itself is a surrogate for flesh. There was a famous statement made by, I think it was de Kooning. He said, flesh was the reason that oil paint was invented. And that's true, because what he meant was that Van Eyck, as the first practitioner of oil painting in the Western tradition, first major one, his versions of bodies were impossible if oil paint didn't hold a certain kind of temperature in the way it did. And when you take that to encaustic, which is the medium that Jasper was using, you actually literally heat the paint up in order to paint it, but then it cools down and it congeals, and so you're seeing a kind of transubstantiation of flesh cooling. And that was what was going on in those paintings, and that's why people found them off-putting. Well, his famous adage was, take something, do something to it, do something else to it. And basically that's a disclaimer. It's a way of saying, I am not choosing something for a specific reason that you can readily identify with, or identify even, but rather I'm just taking at random something, and then I'm going to complicate it by doing something to it, and then by doing something else to it. So that is really where Neo-Dada clicks in. So rather than art of intentional expression, it's an art of indirection, of not doing something, of letting things speak for themselves, and then maybe the things you do for them, enhancing that, or even actually complicating that in some manner that means the viewer has to do more work, that the artist can remain behind his devices or his techniques and not be known. It's a mask, and it's a mask which is a successful one, because if you take it off, there's another mask behind it. And then if you take that off, there's another mask behind that. And so Jasper is an artist of masks. When he chose the flag, he chose it because he wanted to choose things that the mind already knows, in his words. And the American flag was ubiquitous, in America anyway. And it was pretty much ubiquitous around the world. People think they know what it means. Certainly people recognized it the minute it showed up. And so then the questions begin to ask themselves, why is it here? What does it stand for? And so on. So by choosing the flag, he picked this potent question mark, but also one where you never get an answer. And I think now the American flag is equally a matter of question. Of late, we don't any longer know what America is, or the United States are, I should say. The Americas, we know what they are, but geographically, but not what the United States represents. And therefore, I think now it's, again, a time where the American flag is a really big and very unsettling question mark for many people. So who knows, maybe history has come back around to pick Johns up and sort of puff more wind in that sail. But in any case, when he did it, it was never done. Nobody had ever done anything like that before. There were people who had painted flags, into pictures. There were people who painted numbers, and that was something else Johns did. The idea of taking something that the mind already knows, that's already familiar, and where all of the thoughts that one could have about it presumably have been exhausted by that familiarity, and then defamiliarize it, do what the Germans say, the unheimlich, which is the uncanny, is the unfamiliar version of a familiar thing. And that's the game he was playing. That's why he was a Neo-Dadaist. He was defamiliarizing the most commonplace things. And he did that with flags, he did it with numbers, he did it with letter forms, and so on. Meanwhile, Andy Warhol was doing it with a variety of other conventional symbols of movie stardom and so on and so forth. And this idea of taking what everybody knows already and making them not know it was the strategy of Neo-Dada, and was a strategy of a number of artists at the same time who were not necessarily in agreement on anything else, but they recognized that they had this in common at least. I think his Americanness has to do with institutional support, it has to do with the choice of symbols, and it has to do with envy, frankly. And so they don't countenance him because they don't understand him. They don't understand him because they can't afford to collect him, etc. He was far and away the most expensive contemporary artist for a long time. And that was an inhibition. So the people resented that, and I think unfairly so, but it just happened to him, that's all. I think the fact that he's an American artist is daunting for people because they have mixed feelings about America. And I think rather than having them about him and personalizing it, they should have understanding that his work is also about mixed feelings about America. If you look at his maps of America, they're very unstable. You look at his flag, it's very unnerving. If you look at him as a man in society, he is also an odd man out in so many respects that I think one should look through him at America, back at America, rather than at him as typically anything. He's a very literate man, that's we know, and he reads quite a lot. And he reads poetry, and he reads fiction, and he reads a number of things, but he's not an intellectual. He is not himself a poet, although he has a poetic relationship to language. I think, like some of the people he's influenced, Bruce Nauman, for example, he sees words as being plastic elements in their own right. And he also knows that the game of signifier and signified don't always match up. So in the painting False Start, for example, he labels colors, but he gives the wrong label. So there'll be a patch that's mostly yellow that'll be labeled red and whatever, so that if you have a mismatch between word and referent, between the meaning of something and its apparent identity, you already introduce an element of doubt and of confusion into an image. Now, the image is not a picture of something, but it's a description of that thing or of something. And if the descriptions are scrambled and so on and so forth, then the whole game of language, as language, is thrown into relief and thrown into visibility. And there have been a lot of interpretations of his work that take off from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was the Viennese philosopher who began the dialogues or discourses of word games and made a point of showing that all word use is a game. Meaning is a game that you play with different elements of a sentence. And so that those words, if they're dissociated in some ways, become resonant in spite of themselves almost, or more so than if they were used in conventional grammatic structures. So what Jasper's done is he's basically atomized language and then allowed it to speak for itself. But to speak for itself in the sense of saying what? Saying that it is language, making you aware that what you treat as language and think of as being self-evidently meaningful is not in fact self-evidently meaningful. It's meaningful in all kinds of unpredictable and unreliable ways. Jasper's sexuality is important to understanding his work, not because we know what it was, but because he made it important by putting sexual elements in his work so prominently. They're both male and female. They're mostly male, but they're not exclusively so. The fig leaf cast that he took from Duchamp, which is a vagina, basically. And then there's his own work where he casts male genitals and sticks them in the work, or where he describes them. You don't know what he means by them. You don't know what his relationship to them is, other than the fact that he's a man and has them. So, that's in itself not self-evident. Jonathan Katz, who's an American art critic, spent a lot of time trying to track Jasper down to his lair and really say, this is a gay man, and this is what he's not telling you about himself. My question to Jonathan Katz is, how do you know what he is by himself, and how can you know? And I think Jasper's challenge or counter-challenge is the same. He's saying, you don't know what I am sexually, and it's not your business. It is nonetheless true that I'm a sexual being, as is everyone, and that therefore I can make these images, and I can make them in ways that challenge people's assumptions and understandings, that are not personal declarations. This is not confessional art. It's not saying, I am this and therefore I can talk about it. He's saying, I don't know this. You don't know this. I can talk about it because we don't know what it means. Continues to work and has been working against the odds, so to speak, the actuarial odds, and also just the exhaustion of people's willingness to do this thing. It's a very difficult thing to work in the art world and to keep producing and topping yourself in the art world. So I give him all credit for having done that and having attempted to do that, but I think he's also achieved it. So that every time he shows a new body of work, it's kind of against counter pressures that would kill most people. So that's an important factor. The first thing you have to think about him is the variety that he's been able to introduce. The fact that he's never satiated, he's never satisfied, that he always wants more, and that he always wants more and he wants it to be definably different. And that's the way he proceeds, and he's just going to do that till the day he dies. I don't know how many days that will be. I hope quite a lot. Yeah, he's only 90-something, so he could be one of the first centenarian artists of our time, and he could be, in that respect, likened to some of the Renaissance artists that lived to a great, great old age.